January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in thick curtains across the pine-covered ridges, muffling the world beneath a deceptive silence. In a shallow foxhole carved into frozen earth, Gefreiter Klaus Becker pressed his back against the dirt wall, his breath forming clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth. Above him, beyond the skeletal fingers of frost-covered branches, he could hear it. That sound, a sound that had come to haunt the nightmares of every German soldier who had survived long enough to hear it twice. Thump, 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 thump. 5 rounds per second. 600 rounds per minute. Each one a half-inch of copper-jacketed steel, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The Americans called it the Deuce. The Germans called it der Knochenmühle, the bone grinder. Becker had been told in the golden summer of 1941 that American soldiers were soft, factory workers and farmers who knew nothing of real war. He had been told their equipment was mass-produced garbage, quantity over quality, the hallmark of a nation that understood commerce but not combat. He had believed these things because believing them made the war seem winnable, made the sacrifice seem purposeful. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun proved every word a lie. To understand why German soldiers developed such a visceral hatred for this particular American weapon, one must first understand what they had been promised. The Wehrmacht of 1939 was not merely an army, it was the manifestation of an ideology that ranked human beings in hierarchies of worth, that measured the value of nations by the supposed quality of their blood. German soldiers marched into Poland, into France, into the Soviet Union carrying not just rifles and ammunition, but the weight of certainty. They had been told they were inherently superior warriors, sons of a martial tradition stretching back through Prussian discipline to Teutonic knights. Their machine guns reflected this philosophy. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 were engineering marvels, weapons designed with precision, built with craftsmanship, capable of rates of fire that turned the air itself into a wall of death. The MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, earning it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw for the sound it made when tearing through Soviet infantry. German squad tactics built themselves around these weapons. While other armies organized squads around riflemen supported by machine guns, the Wehrmacht organized riflemen around machine guns supported by riflemen. The machine gun was the center, the heart, the killing instrument around which everything else revolved. American machine guns, the Germans had been told, could not compare. The Browning M1917 was a water-cooled relic from the previous war. The M1919 was underpowered, its P30 caliber rounds lacking the penetrating force of German 7.90 mm ammunition. American tactical doctrine was assumed to be simplistic, their training rushed, their industrial methods producing adequate quantity while sacrificing quality. No one had warned them about the .50 caliber. The Browning M2 machine gun, adopted by the United States military in 1933, was not designed to kill infantry. This was perhaps its first betrayal of German expectations. It was designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, a tool to strike aircraft from the sky, to penetrate armor plating, to destroy vehicles and fortifications. The .50 caliber BMG, Browning machine gun round, was not a bullet in any conventional sense. It was a small artillery shell, weighing between 1.5 and 1.7 ounces, carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through half an inch of steel plate at 500 yards. When such a weapon was turned against human beings, the results were not combat, they were liquidation. Lieutenant Werner Schultz, in a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence in October 1944, wrote to his wife, "We can no longer call them battles. When the Americans establish their positions, they bring these weapons, these terrible heavy machine guns, and they do not stop firing. Our boys lie behind stones, behind logs, behind the very earth itself, and still the rounds find them. I have seen men simply come apart, Greta. I have seen bodies with holes I could put my fist through. We cannot advance. We can only die or retreat. The effective range of the MG-42, for all its vicious rate of fire, was approximately 800 meters against infantry targets. The M2 Browning could reach out to 1,800 meters and still kill with certainty. This meant that German soldiers, advancing or defending, found themselves under fire from distances where their own weapons were useless. They could see the muzzle flashes. They could hear the distinctive report, slower and deeper than their own machine guns, rhythmic rather than frenzied. But they could not return fire effectively. They could only endure, and endurance against the M2 was measured in seconds. German soldiers had been raised in a society where scarcity was managed, where resources were allocated according to hierarchies of importance, where the state decided who received what and when. Even the Wehrmacht, for all its early conquests, fought a war of calculated ammunition expenditures. Machine gunners were trained to fire in short, disciplined bursts. Ammunition was precious. Every round counted. The Americans seemed to have no such concerns. Positions defended by M2 Brownings appeared to possess infinite ammunition. The guns fired not in bursts, but in long, sustained sweeps. The gunners walking the tracers across suspected positions, through walls, through vehicles, through anything that might conceal an enemy. Captured German soldiers, interviewed by U.S. Army intelligence officers in 1944 and 1945, reported a psychological effect beyond the weapon's physical lethality. The sound of the .50 caliber, firing continuously for minutes at a time, communicated something more than suppressive fire. It communicated abundance. It communicated an enemy so wealthy in resources that they could afford to spend ammunition like water. An enemy for whom the industrial capacity to produce bullets exceeded any need to conserve them. This was not merely frustrating. It was ideologically subversive. The Nazi state had organized itself around the concept of struggle. Kampf, the idea that life was an eternal competition for scarce resources, that only the strong deserved to survive, that nature itself was a war of all against all. The sound of an M2 Browning firing 1,200 rounds in an afternoon engagement suggested a different worldview. It suggested a society so productive, so organized, so fundamentally wealthy that it could equip its soldiers with weapons that threw away in minutes what a German squad might be allocated for a week. It suggested that the Americans were not winning through superior bloodlines or warrior spirit, but through superior industrial organization, democratic efficiency, and economic abundance. For soldiers who had marched to war believing in their own intrinsic superiority, this realization was poison. Traditional infantry combat, as practiced by armies for centuries, relied on the concept of cover and concealment. A soldier behind a stone wall was safe from rifle fire. A soldier in a reinforced bunker could hold off an attack. A soldier inside a building had tactical advantage over soldiers in the open. These were axioms, fundamental truths of warfare that had held since men first threw rocks at one another. The M2 Browning treated these axioms with contempt. The .50 caliber round, particularly the armor-piercing variant, could defeat cover that German soldiers considered absolute. Stone walls disintegrated. Wooden structures became sawdust. Light vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, even armored cars with insufficient plating were penetrated as though they were made of paper. German soldiers learned, through brutal experience, that cover which stopped rifle rounds, which stopped submachine gun fire, which even stopped their own 7.92mm machine gun bullets, offered no protection whatsoever against the heavy machine gun. Combat reports from the Italian campaign, beginning in 1943, documented this learning curve written in blood. At Monte Cassino, German paratroopers, elite troops considered among the finest defensive fighters in the Wehrmacht, discovered that their carefully prepared positions in stone buildings could be systematically dismantled by American .50 caliber positions. Walls 3 feet thick, which had stood for centuries, were chewed through in hours. Firing ports that had seemed tactically perfect became death traps as M2 gunners fired sustained bursts through them, the rounds continuing through the opening and ricocheting inside the structure. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a company commander in the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, noted in his after-action report, "The American heavy machine gun makes a mockery of our defensive preparations. Positions that should hold for days are untenable in hours. My men refuse to occupy stone buildings because they have learned these structures are not protection, but tombs. We cannot construct fortifications that will stop these weapons without engineering equipment we do not possess, and time we are not given." The psychological impact of losing faith in cover cannot be overstated. Infantry combat requires soldiers to believe that tactical decisions matter, that choosing the right position, the right angle, the right structure can mean the difference between life and death. When a weapon system eliminates that calculus, when it makes all positions equally vulnerable, it removes the soldier's sense of agency. German troops facing American positions defended by M2 Brownings reported feeling hunted rather than engaged in combat, pursued by a weapon that could reach them anywhere, that could kill them through whatever they hid behind. This was not war, as they had been taught to fight it. This was extermination. The German military doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, warfare of movement, relied on vehicles. Motorcycles, trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, and light tanks were the tools that had enabled the Wehrmacht to conquer most of Europe in less than 2 years. German soldiers traveled to war in vehicles, were supplied by vehicles, expected to be evacuated by vehicles if wounded. Mobility was not merely tactical, it was doctrinal, the foundation upon which German operations were built. The M2 Browning turned vehicles into coffins. Unlike the .30 caliber machine guns common to most infantry formations, the .50 caliber was perfectly capable of destroying soft-skinned vehicles and damaging armored ones. The armor-piercing incendiary round could penetrate 0.9 inches of steel at 200 yards. This was sufficient to destroy the engine blocks of trucks, to punch through the thin armor of half-tracks, to penetrate the side and rear armor of light tanks. American jeeps, mounted with M2 Brownings, became hunter-killers, racing along roads and firing into German convoys, each burst setting vehicles ablaze, each burning vehicle blocking the road, each blocked road creating a static target for artillery and aircraft. The German experience on the Western Front after June 1944 became a nightmare of immobility. Convoys that attempted to move during daylight were destroyed by aircraft. Convoys that moved at night were ambushed by American patrols equipped with .50 caliber weapons. Units became stationary, unable to concentrate for counterattacks, unable to withdraw from untenable positions, unable to maneuver in the way their doctrine demanded. The M2 Browning, often mounted on vehicles but sometimes emplaced in fixed positions overlooking key roads, created kill zones that German transport could not survive. Oberst Hans von Luck, a regimental commander in the 21st Panzer Division, recalled after the war, "We were an armored division that could not move. Our tanks were hidden in forests and villages, immobile for fear of American aircraft. Our supply trucks were destroyed on every road. And always, there were the heavy machine guns. I lost more men to the .50 caliber than to artillery in those weeks after the invasion. It was not a weapon system, it was a cordon, a noose, tightening around our necks." The Wehrmacht had entered the war as the most mobile army in Europe. By 1944, facing enemies equipped with weapons like the M2 Browning, it had become a largely static force, its vehicles too vulnerable to use, its mobility dissolved by the very industrial abundance it had dismissed. The M2 Browning's original purpose, Anti-aircraft defense became another source of German hatred, particularly among the Luftwaffe. German pilots, already facing overwhelming odds by 1944, discovered that even low-level flight over American positions was suicidal. The .50 caliber, with its long effective range and heavy projectile, could reach aircraft that flew below 1,500 feet with devastating effect. Unlike smaller caliber weapons that required many hits to bring down an aircraft, the M2 could destroy a plane with a single well-placed round through the engine, through the fuel tank, through the pilot. The Normandy invasion showcased this capability in horrifying detail. German aircraft attempting to strafe American beachheads were met not by rifle fire, but by hundreds of M2 Brownings mounted on ships, on landing craft, on hastily emplaced positions in the sand. The sky became a wall of tracers, every fifth round showing the gunner where his stream of death was traveling, allowing for rapid correction. German pilots who had trained to fear anti-aircraft artillery discovered that the more dangerous threat was the heavy machine gun, ubiquitous and lethal, turning every flight into Russian roulette. Lieutenant Gustav Schneider, a fighter pilot who survived the war, recalled, "We were told to attack the beaches, to strafe the landing craft, to show the Americans that the Luftwaffe still had teeth. I made one pass. One. The tracers rose to meet us like a wall of light. I saw Miller's plane simply disintegrate. He was there, and then he was not. Just pieces falling into the sea. The sound of the rounds hitting aircraft was like hammers on sheet metal. We climbed away and did not return. What was the point? They had thousands of those guns. We had perhaps 30 aircraft. The mathematics was murder." This transformation of airspace above American positions into lethal territory had strategic implications. German aircraft, already scarce, became essentially absent over battlefields where American forces had established themselves. Reconnaissance was impossible. Close air support could not be provided to German ground forces. The few aircraft that did attempt missions were often damaged or destroyed, the loss rate making each mission a potential death sentence. The M2 Browning, designed in the 1920s to shoot down biplanes, proved perfectly capable of shooting down fighters and bombers 2 decades later. Perhaps the most ideologically troubling aspect of the M2 Browning, from the perspective of German soldiers raised on Nazi racial theories, was its ubiquity. This was not a weapon reserved for elite units, not a special tool allocated only to crack troops. The Americans mounted .50 caliber machine guns on jeeps, on trucks, on half-tracks, on tanks, on landing craft, on patrol boats. They emplaced them in defensive positions, on airfields, guarding bridges, protecting headquarters. By 1944, it seemed to German soldiers that every American position, every American vehicle, every American unit possessed these weapons. The contrast with German equipment allocation could not have been starker. German doctrine reserved heavy weapons for specific units. The MG-42 was precious, allocated carefully, supported by dedicated ammunition carriers. Anti-tank weapons, mortars, and certainly anti-aircraft guns were specialized equipment requiring trained crews. The German military was a hierarchy of capability, where elite units received the best equipment and standard. Infantry made do with less. The American military appeared to operate on different principles. The .50 caliber was everywhere, because American industrial capacity could make it everywhere. The M2 Browning was not particularly complex. John Browning had designed it to be manufacturable, maintainable, reliable. American factories produced them by the tens of thousands. American doctrine assumed that every unit, every position, every vehicle could and should have the best available weapon for its role. This was not elitism. This was industrial democracy, the application of abundant production to military needs. For German soldiers, this abundance was damning. It suggested that the Americans were not winning because their soldiers were better, but because their system was better. It suggested that a society organized around democratic principles and industrial capitalism could outproduce, out-equip, and ultimately overwhelm a society organized around hierarchy and racial mythology. Every M2 Browning they faced was evidence that they had been lied to, that the promise of inherent superiority was hollow, that the war was not a test of blood and will, but a test of production and organization. And they were losing. By late 1944, as German forces fell back across France, back to the German border, back into Germany itself, the M2 Browning had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol, a representative of everything the German military had underestimated. Its sound, that distinctive, methodical thump, 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 preceded American advances like the footsteps of inevitability. German soldiers, dug into defensive positions, would hear the .50 calibers open fire and know that the attack was beginning, that once again they would be pinned down by weapons that could kill them through their cover, that could destroy their vehicles, that could reach across distances their own weapons could not answer. The weapon haunted their withdrawals. American pursuit was relentless, and M2 Brownings mounted on fast-moving vehicles made retreat a gauntlet of death. German units attempting to fall back in good order found themselves under fire from weapons that could kill at ranges where return fire was impossible. Rearguard positions, meant to delay American advances, were suppressed not by artillery or aircraft, but by heavy machine guns that simply fired continuously until the position was abandoned or annihilated. Feldwebel Otto Krause, captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, told his interrogators, "We stopped fearing the rifles. We stopped fearing the grenades. These were soldiers' weapons, things we understood. But the .50 caliber, that we feared. That sound meant you would die, or you would run. And there was no honor in either. We ran a great deal in those last months. The weapon taught us that survival was more important than ideology." This was perhaps the ultimate betrayal the M2 Browning represented to German soldiers, who had been raised on notions of martial honor and ideological commitment. It was a weapon so effective, so ubiquitous, so overwhelming in its application that it made continued resistance seem pointless. It stripped away the mythology of the warrior and replaced it with the arithmetic of industrial warfare. German soldiers had been told they were heroes in a cosmic struggle. The .50 caliber machine gun suggested they were simply workers on the losing side of an economic competition, that their lives would be spent not in glorious combat, but in futile resistance to a force that could always bring more guns, more ammunition, more of everything than they could ever muster in response. While German soldiers retreated, while their equipment broke down, while their supply lines collapsed, and their ammunition dwindled, the M2 Browning continued to function. John Browning had designed the weapon with remarkable foresight. It was simple enough to manufacture en masse, robust enough to function in any environment, reliable enough to fire tens of thousands of rounds with minimal maintenance. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in the mud of the Siegfried Line, in the rubble of German cities, the M2 continued to fire. German weapons, for all their precision engineering, suffered in comparison. The MG-42, magnificent in its rate of fire, required careful maintenance and relatively clean conditions. Its barrels overheated rapidly, requiring frequent changes. Its ammunition feed was sensitive to dirt and damage. When German logistics collapsed in the final months of the war, when cleaning supplies were unavailable and replacement parts were non-existent, the MG-42s jammed and failed with increasing frequency. The Americans seemed to have no such problems. Their weapons were designed for conscript armies, for soldiers with minimal training, for conditions where meticulous maintenance was impossible. The M2 Browning could be buried in mud, frozen in ice, exposed to rain and dust and neglect, and would still fire when needed. This reliability, this mechanical democracy that assumed users would be average soldiers in terrible conditions rather than expert marksmen in ideal circumstances, proved devastatingly effective. German soldiers, watching their own weapons fail while American weapons continued to function, learned another bitter lesson about industrial philosophy. The Wehrmacht had equipped itself with weapons that reflected an ideal, precise, powerful, designed for expert users. The Americans had equipped themselves with weapons that reflected reality, robust, reliable, designed for anyone to use in any condition. In the collision between ideal and real, reality won. The deepest hatred German soldiers felt for the M2 Browning was not physical, but spiritual. It was a weapon that killed belief. German soldiers had marched to war believing in their superiority, in their ideology, in the promises made by their leaders. Every encounter with the .50 caliber machine gun eroded those beliefs. Every time they were pinned down by fire from ranges they could not answer. Every time they watched vehicles disintegrate and comrades torn apart. Every time they heard that mechanical thumping announcing another American position, another American advance, another inevitable defeat, they learned that they had been lied to. The M2 Browning was not supposed to exist in the world the Nazis had promised. In that world, German engineering would be supreme. German soldiers would be naturally superior warriors, and American industry would produce only quantity without quality. The reality that American engineers had designed a weapon in the 1920s that would still be in service nearly a century later, that American industry could produce it in quantities that equipped every unit and every vehicle, that American soldiers with relatively little training could employ it with devastating effectiveness, shattered the mythology. Some German soldiers, in letters and diaries later recovered, expressed this realization with startling clarity. Gefreiter Johann Stein wrote in January 1945, "We were children, believing in fairy tales. They told us we were wolves, and the Americans were sheep. But sheep do not build machine guns that tear through stone. Sheep do not produce ammunition in quantities beyond counting. We were not wolves. We were dogs, sent to fight bears, and our masters lied about which was which." This awakening was not universal. Many German soldiers remained committed to the ideology, even as the war was obviously lost. But for many, the M2 Browning became a teacher. Its lessons written in the deaths of friends, the destruction of equipment, the steady retreat from every position, the inescapable evidence that the promises had been hollow, and the ideology had been a lie. The Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun was not the most advanced weapon of World War II. It was not the fastest firing, not the most accurate at extreme ranges, not the most technologically sophisticated, but it was, perhaps, the most representative. It represented an America that German soldiers had been told did not exist, an America that could design weapons of brutal efficiency, manufacture them in overwhelming quantities, and distribute them so widely that they became ubiquitous on the battlefield. It represented a philosophy of warfare that contradicted everything the Wehrmacht had been built to embody. Where German doctrine emphasized precision, American doctrine emphasized abundance. Where German organization created hierarchies of equipment allocation, American organization democratized capability. Where German ideology promised that will and blood would triumph over materiel, American production proved that materiel, properly applied, would overwhelm will and blood. The hatred German soldiers felt for the M2 Browning was not simply the hatred of an effective weapon. It was the hatred of a symbol, of a messenger bearing news they did not want to hear. Every time that weapon fired, it announced that the war was lost, that the ideology had failed, that the promises were lies. It announced that they had spent their youth, their health, their lives in service of leaders who had sent them to fight an enemy they did not understand, with resources they could not match. 70 years after the guns fell silent, the M2 Browning remains in service with the United States military and dozens of others worldwide. It still fires the same ammunition at the same rate, still reaches across impossible distances, still turns cover into concealment and vehicles into scrap metal. John Browning, who died in 1926, never saw his creation used in war, never knew that it would become one of the most enduring military tools ever devised, never understood that he had designed not just a weapon, but a statement about industrial civilization itself. The Germans who faced it understood. They understood in the frozen forests, in the burning cities, in the final desperate months when the Reich collapsed around them. They understood that they had gone to war against a nation they had been told was weak, and that nation had brought weapons they could not answer, in quantities they could not match, supported by an industrial capacity that seemed infinite. They understood, finally, that the war had never been winnable, that the odds had always been impossible, that the ideology had sent them to die for lies. The M2 Browning taught this lesson 500 rounds at a time, in a voice that echoed across every battlefield from Normandy to the Ruhr. It taught it to men who had believed themselves superior and learned they were merely soldiers, fighting a war their nation could not win, armed with beliefs that could not survive contact with reality. And so, they hated it, not as a soldier hates an enemy's weapon, but as a believer hates the evidence that proves his faith was misplaced. They hated it because it was good at killing them. They hated it because it was everywhere. They hated it because it worked when their own weapons failed. But most of all, they hated it because it was true. And the truth, in the end, was heavier than any bullet.